can.
I believe that a few minutes before 2 a.m., at least in the part of Caracas where I live, which is downtown Caracas, the electricity went down, and immediately explosions and aircraft noise was, I hear that. A few minutes later, I managed to dress up and go outside, and we have been reporting live since that.
At 2:41 a.m. local time, radar screens inside the Venezuelan Air Defense Command headquarters in Caracas flickered with contacts that should not have been there. Multiple airborne signatures moving fast, approaching from the northeast across the Caribbean Sea. The duty officer leaned forward, his hand hovering over the red alert button. The signatures were military, they were foreign, and they were coming in hot. Within 90 seconds, alarm klaxons tore through the stillness of Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex on the southwestern edge of the capital. Officers scrambled from their bunks. Phones rang in command centers across the city, and in a reinforced bunker beneath Miraflores Palace, President Nicolás Maduro was shaken awake by his chief of security. The message was short. The message was terrifying. Unidentified aircraft had violated Venezuelan airspace. They were inbound. They were armed. This was not a drill. The world had been watching Venezuela spiral for years. Economic collapse, mass migration, hyperinflation, international sanctions, a government clinging to power through force and fear. But what happened in the early hours of this morning was different. This was not political theater. This was not diplomatic posturing. This was the United States Air Force, and they were striking deep inside sovereign Venezuelan territory. At precisely 2:47 a.m., the first explosions ripped through Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base, located just 12 miles east of downtown Caracas. The base, known locally as La Carlota, sits in a valley surrounded by dense urban sprawl. It houses Venezuelan Air Force fighter squadrons, transport units, and command infrastructure. Witnesses on the ground reported a series of bright flashes followed by deep rolling thunder that shook apartment buildings miles away. Social media erupted. Videos showed fireballs rising into the night sky. The sound of secondary explosions echoed across the valley as fuel depots ignited, but La Carlota was not alone. 6 minutes later, Fort Tiuna itself came under attack. This is the nerve center of Venezuela's armed forces. It sprawls across hundreds of acres in the Cota Mill district, housing the Ministry of Defense, Army headquarters, armored units, and key logistics hubs. The strikes were precise. They targeted ammunition depots, vehicle maintenance hangars, and communications arrays. Surveillance footage later released by Venezuelan state media showed massive craters where buildings once stood. Fires burned uncontrolled through the night. The Venezuelan military, caught flat-footed, scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft batteries came online. Surface-to-air missiles were launched blindly into the darkness, but the American aircraft were already gone. The Pentagon had been planning this for months. Intelligence sources confirmed that the strike package included at least 6 F-15E Strike Eagles operating out of Homestead Air Reserve Base in Florida, supported by EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft and a KC-135 Stratotanker for mid-air refueling. The Strike Eagles, loaded with GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, penetrated Venezuelan airspace at low altitude to evade radar. They flew in complete radio silence. Their targeting data had been uploaded hours earlier, satellite coordinates locked into onboard systems. The pilots knew their targets, they knew their escape routes, and they knew that once the first bomb fell, there would be no turning back. The decision to launch the strike had been made in the Oval Office less than 72 hours prior. President Donald Trump, seated at the Resolute desk, had listened to a briefing from his National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They laid out the intelligence. Venezuelan military forces had allegedly been massing near the Colombian border. There were reports of collaboration with Russian military advisors. There were whispers of advanced missile systems being moved into position. And then there was the geopolitical calculus, Venezuela's proximity to the United States, its vast oil reserves, its alignment with adversarial powers. Trump, according to sources in the room, listened in silence. Then he asked a single question: could it be done clean? Could they hit hard, hit fast, and send a message without triggering a wider war? The military said yes. Trump said go. But inside the Pentagon, not everyone was convinced. Senior officers understood the implications. This was not Iraq. This was not Libya. Venezuela is in the Western Hemisphere, less than 2,000 miles from Miami. It is a member of the Organization of American States. Striking a sovereign nation without a formal declaration of war, without United Nations approval, without even notifying Congress, was legally and morally complex. Some argued it was reckless. Others called it necessary. The debate raged behind closed doors. But in the end, the commander-in-chief had made his choice. And now, as dawn broke over Caracas, the world was waking up to the consequences. Inside Miraflores Palace, chaos reigned. Maduro, dressed in a military uniform, hastily pulled over pajamas, convened an emergency meeting of his Security Council. The room was crowded. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, intelligence chiefs, military commanders, everyone shouting at once. How had the Americans penetrated so deep? Why had radar systems failed to provide adequate warning? Where were the Russian advisors who had promised to upgrade Venezuela's air defenses? Maduro, visibly shaken, demanded answers, but there were none. Only the grim reality that Venezuelan sovereignty had been violated in the most brutal way imaginable. At 4:15 a.m., Maduro addressed the nation. The broadcast was hastily arranged. He stood before a backdrop of the Venezuelan flag, flanked by military officers. His voice trembled with rage. He declared the attack an act of imperialist aggression. He invoked the memory of Simón Bolívar. He called on the Venezuelan people to defend the homeland. And then, significantly, he issued a direct warning to the United States. Any further aggression would be met with total resistance. Venezuela, he said, would not stand alone. It had allies, powerful allies, and those allies would not tolerate American military intervention in Latin America. He did not need to name them. Everyone knew he meant Russia and China. In Moscow, the Kremlin's response was swift and ominous. A spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry condemned the strikes as a flagrant violation of international law. Russia, which has invested billions of dollars in Venezuela's oil sector and maintains a small military presence in the country, warned of serious consequences. The statement stopped short of threatening military retaliation, but the implication was clear. Russia views Venezuela as a strategic partner, a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a counterbalance to American dominance. Any move to topple Maduro risks drawing Moscow deeper into the crisis. Beijing's response was more measured, but no less significant. The Chinese Foreign Ministry expressed grave concern and called for restraint on all sides. China, like Russia, has major economic interests in Venezuela. It has lent tens of billions of dollars to the Maduro regime, much of it collateralized against future oil shipments. A collapse of the Venezuelan government would jeopardize those investments. More importantly, it would signal to the world that the United States is willing to use military force unilaterally to reshape Latin America. For Beijing, already locked in a strategic competition with Washington, that is unacceptable. Across Latin America, the reaction was mixed. Right-leaning governments in Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina issued cautious statements supporting the Venezuelan people's struggle for democracy, but stopped short of endorsing the strikes. They understand the humanitarian crisis spilling over their borders. They want change in Caracas, but they also fear the precedent of U.S. military intervention. If Washington can strike Venezuela today, what stops it from intervening elsewhere tomorrow? Left-leaning governments in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba were far less restrained. They denounced the attacks as American imperialism. They rallied to Maduro's defense, and they called for an emergency meeting of regional organizations to condemn the aggression. The Organization of American States, already fractured over Venezuela, descended into further chaos. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. Russia and China demanded an immediate investigation and hinted at possible sanctions against the United States. The American ambassador, defiant, argued that Venezuela had become a threat to regional stability and that the strikes were a proportionate response to credible intelligence. But what was that intelligence? According to leaked documents, U.S. intelligence agencies had been tracking a surge in Russian military flights into Venezuela over the past 3 months. These flights, originating from bases in Syria and the Russian Far East, were delivering advanced radar systems, communications equipment, and possibly surface-to-air missile batteries. There were also reports of Russian and Cuban military advisors embedded with Venezuelan units near the Colombian border. The concern in Washington was that Venezuela, emboldened by external support, might attempt a provocation, perhaps a border skirmish with Colombia, perhaps harassment of American shipping in the Caribbean, perhaps something worse. There were also darker whispers of Venezuelan cooperation with transnational criminal organizations, whispers of drug trafficking networks moving cocaine through the Caribbean with government protection, whispers of Iranian operatives using Venezuela as a staging ground for activities in the Western Hemisphere. True or not, these narratives had gained traction in certain circles in Washington. They provided a convenient justification for action, and they fed into a broader strategic anxiety about hostile powers gaining influence in America's backyard. But justifications aside, the immediate question was what comes next. Inside the White House Situation Room, Trump met again with his national security team. The strikes had achieved their tactical objectives. Key Venezuelan military installations had been damaged. Maduro's command and control capabilities had been degraded. The message had been sent. But now came the hard part: how to manage the fallout, how to prevent escalation, and how to ensure that Maduro, weakened but still in power, did not retaliate in unpredictable ways. Some advisors urged restraint. The strikes, they argued, were a warning shot. Now was the time for diplomacy. Reach out to regional partners. Isolate Maduro further. Let internal pressure finish the job. Others pushed for more. They argued that half measures would only embolden the regime. If the goal was regime change, then the United States needed to commit fully, increase the pressure, support opposition forces on the ground, prepare for a broader campaign if necessary. Trump characteristically kept his cards close. He praised the military's performance. He dismissed concerns about international backlash, but he also signaled caution. He did not want American troops on the ground. He did not want a protracted conflict. He wanted results. Fast, clean, decisive. But wars, even small ones, rarely go according to plan. On the ground in Venezuela, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The strikes had killed dozens of Venezuelan military personnel. Exact casualty figures were unclear, but early reports suggested at least 40 dead, with many more wounded. Maduro's government claimed that civilian areas had been hit, that innocent people had died in their homes. American officials denied this, insisting that the strikes had been surgically precise, limited to military targets. But in the fog of war, truth is often the first casualty. Social media was flooded with images, some real, some fake, some impossible to verify. The information battlefield was as chaotic as the physical one. In the streets of Caracas, reactions were divided. Some Venezuelans, exhausted by years of economic misery and political repression, saw the strikes as a catalyst for change. They hoped that external pressure might finally dislodge Maduro. Others, even those who despised the regime, recoiled at foreign intervention. National pride, even in a failing state, runs deep. The idea of American bombs falling on Venezuelan soil, regardless of the target, sparked anger and resentment. Opposition leaders, caught off guard, struggled to navigate the moment. Some condemned the strikes, others remained silent. A few cautiously suggested that while they did not support military action, they understood the frustration driving it. Meanwhile, Maduro moved quickly to consolidate his grip. He declared a state of emergency. He mobilized the military and paramilitary collectivos. He ordered the arrest of suspected dissidents, claiming they were collaborating with foreign aggressors. Security forces fanned out across the capital, setting up checkpoints, searching homes, stifling any hint of opposition. The message was clear. This was not the moment for internal dissent. Venezuela was under attack. Unity, even forced unity, was required. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Venezuela's military, long the backbone of Maduro's power, was shaken. The strikes had exposed their vulnerability. They had been unable to detect, much less stop, the American attack. Morale was low. Equipment was outdated. Supplies were scarce. And now, officers were quietly asking themselves a dangerous question. Was it worth risking their lives for a regime that seemed increasingly doomed? Defections, always a risk, became more likely. Rumors swirled of senior officers in secret communication with the opposition, of contingency plans being drawn up, of quiet negotiations with foreign powers. Nothing concrete, nothing confirmed, but enough to make Maduro paranoid, and paranoia in a dictator is dangerous. On the international stage, the crisis was metastasizing. NATO allies expressed concern, but offered no concrete support. European nations, wary of American unilateralism, called for dialogue. The European Union condemned the strikes and urged all parties to return to the negotiating table. But their influence was limited. This was a Western Hemisphere issue, and Washington was not interested in European input. In the Middle East, Iran issued a statement of solidarity with Venezuela, calling the strikes an example of American lawlessness. Tehran, itself locked in a long-running confrontation with Washington, saw an opportunity to portray the United States as a rogue actor. And in Africa and Asia, non-aligned nations watched nervously. If the United States could strike Venezuela with impunity, what did that mean for the international order? What did it mean for sovereignty? What did it mean for them? Inside the United Nations, the Security Council remained deadlocked. Russia and China demanded resolutions condemning the strikes. The United States, predictably, vetoed them. The General Assembly debated emergency measures. Speeches were made, statements were issued, but concrete action was impossible. The United Nations, designed to prevent conflicts like this, was paralyzed by great power rivalry, and so the world watched impotent and anxious as events in Caracas spiraled beyond anyone's control. Back in Washington, Congress erupted. Democrats demanded hearings. They accused the president of bypassing constitutional checks and balances. They questioned the intelligence. They warned of mission creep. Some called for impeachment. Republicans mostly rallied behind Trump. They praised his decisiveness. They argued that strong action was necessary to counter hostile regimes. But even within the GOP, there were dissenting voices. Libertarian-leaning members questioned the legality of the strikes. Hawks worried that the operation had been too limited, that it would invite retaliation without achieving regime change. The political battle lines were drawn, and as always in Washington, the fight was as much about domestic politics as foreign policy. Intelligence analysts, meanwhile, were poring over satellite imagery and signals intercepts, trying to assess the damage and predict Maduro's next move. The strikes had degraded Venezuela's military capability, but they had not destroyed it. The regime still controlled the capital, it still had loyalist units, and it still had access to weapons, including potentially surface-to-air missiles capable of downing American aircraft. There was also the question of asymmetric retaliation. Venezuela could not strike the continental United States directly, but it could target American interests in the region. Embassies, oil facilities, shipping lanes. And then there were the proxies, criminal networks, militias, terrorist groups. Maduro, backed into a corner, might lash out in unpredictable ways. The risk of wider conflict was real. Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor and a key US ally, was on high alert. The two nations share a long, porous border, and tensions have simmered for years. Colombian officials feared that Venezuela might launch a retaliatory strike, perhaps blaming Colombia for facilitating the American attack. They moved troops to the border, they reinforced air defenses, and they quietly requested additional American support. The Pentagon responded with surveillance aircraft and intelligence sharing, but stopped short of deploying combat forces. No one wanted to turn this into a regional war. In the Caribbean, navies were mobilizing.